Governance Research Colloquium, and it's a very, very big pleasure to welcome today Ransford Mensah on a really interesting topic, but also it's really wonderful to have you here with us. We had already some longer contact with Ransford, and we thought he's so interesting as a scholar, as an expert. We would really like to invite him. He's consultant for the World Bank, but he also has a kind of a clear academic background. I mean, currently at the World Bank, he's in the digital development global practice, very much focusing on government digitalization, so a topic which is, of course, very relevant, interesting for us. Before that, he was country lead on digitalization for the UN Foundation Digital Impact Alliance in Sierra Leone. He has a doctoral degree in information systems from Australia, the University of Southern Queensland. Ransford has a Master of Science in Engineering, so he has an engineering background from Coventry University, UK, and has a lot of practical experience, but also scholarly experience on government digitalization. And the field you are now focusing on, I think that's really a very, very interesting, promising field. We have a lot of contact with GIZ here in Germany. They also very much focus on this idea of digital building blocks. And your title, Accelerating the Digital Transformation of Government Service Using an Interoperable Digital Building Blocks, Experiences from Africa, already somehow tells us the key idea and expectation of this digital building block. It's not everybody has to reinvent, has to develop the same solutions again, but we could profit a lot from more exchange of certain building blocks, which then could be transferred to other countries. And I think that's a very new, interesting approach, a very promising approach. But all of us who are in this government sphere also know how challenging. So we, for example, at Germany, we experience it's even not easy to transfer one solution from one German government body to another. So the idea of having really a global transfer of digital building block solutions is even more challenging, demanding, but also interesting and promising. And of course, Africa is or the global south is a very interesting area to look for the perspectives of this idea. And this is exactly where the experience, expertise of Ransford comes in. So we are very glad, Ransford, that you join us today. And we are very much looking forward to your presentation. The idea, the normal format of our forum is, all of you, or many of you already know that, presentation of 30-35 minutes, and then we should have enough time to go into discussion, Q&A. I will moderate it a little bit. The ones of you who have a bad connection, you also can bring in your comments, your questions into the blog. I will check that a little bit, or in the chat, but also even better would be just raise your hand. I would give the voice to you, and then we go into a direct conversation exchange with Ransford. With that, I want to stop my intro and would pass over to Ransford. Very glad that you're here with us, Ransford, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Oh, I thought I'll get some emojis, everyone clapping and things like that. Okay, so let me share my screen and then let's get into this. Okay, so kindly confirm if you can see my screen.
Yeah,
confirmed. Wonderful. Okay, then. So it's a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are connecting from. So let me first thank Prof. Gerard and the Hertie School of Center for Digital Governance and the team for this opportunity to present my research to you all. So my research is on how to accelerate the digital transformation of government services, mainly using an interoperable digital building blocks approach, and is a reflective practitioner perspective. So I think Prof. Gerard has given you an extensive brief of my background, who I am, and everything. But because I work with the World Bank and because this research is actually in my personal capacity, I need to state that I'm delivering these remarks in my personal capacity, and these remarks do not necessarily reflect the views of the World Bank, its members, or its board of executive directors. So this is to make sure that we have that on record. Okay, so for today, I've broken the presentation into 5 main segments. So we'll look at the Liberia context, and this is because in my previous work, many years ago, I was working for Liberia as a digital development consultant on the USA Digital Liberia project, So that was where the whole inspiration of building blocks started from. So I'll give a bit of context because that links directly to my current research. And then also we'll look at the problem statement. Then I'll talk a bit about a tool that I developed the time that I was doing my PhD, and this is called the e-government extended process virtualization tool. And then because this is also an academic forum, definitely we need to highlight a number of key references. Okay. So digital government in the last decade has become an important area of focus for government strategy in Africa. But the issue is that many developing countries in Africa are struggling with the implementation of digital services. In fact, there's a researcher called Hicks. Hicks is a professor in Manchester University. And from one of his papers, I think from 2003, he mentioned that about 85% of e-government initiatives in Africa are either a total failure or a partial failure. So with the study in Liberia, what I did was to focus on how governments could migrate services to the digital platform. So to do this, the research adopted a framework called the extended process virtualization theory. And then also it had elements of PDI, problem-driven iterative adaptation. So we'll pack these for now because I'll go into it more extensively as we progress through the presentation. But then, unlike most frameworks sometimes, this framework was actually used and it was validated by using it to select government services which could be virtualized. So that showed the utility of the tool or the utility of the framework. So through this research, we were quite successful. We were able to publish a number of conference papers, journal papers, and a book chapter. In fact, just the beginning of this year, we received an acknowledgement or recognition from the Electronic Journal of Information Systems that this paper has been rated as the top cited article for 2021 to 2022. So now gradually building up to what we are to discuss. So the evolution of IT, and in this case, I'm using the context of Liberia and Sierra Leone. In Sierra Leone, Liberia, it's not too different from that of many countries, okay? And where it is very easy to deploy services across ministries, departments. But looking at this, as more systems are implemented, it has become very complicated and messy. So for example, in Sierra Leone, there's a situation where for each system rolled out, a separate network must also accompany it. To the extent that for some networks, it's actually been named after the service or the platform. So we hear something like, this is IFMIS network. IFMIS stands for Integrated Financial Management Information System. This is their network. And it's making deployment of government services very, very, very difficult. So in information systems, you can see that government is normally regarded as a business, rolling out business processes. And there's a lot of demand on IT for services and projects. And these are coming from multiple lines. In fact, most MDAs, or when I say MDAs, meaning ministry departments and agencies, it has become very difficult to manage these demands and then also even manage their priority levels. So then what it means is that the department or the MDA that screams the loudest is the one that gets the service. So it is so difficult that IT or technology is being seen as a black box. It's not really delivering value, and government is very uncomfortable with the current situation. So then what that means also is that there's a problem with disparate systems. There's no integration and nothing is scalable. Now, most e-government projects face one or more of the following. First, integration and interoperability issues. So there's lack of integration across various applications within or across government departments, and this leads to silos. And each department having their own set of data management procedures, government applications. So this further leads to the duplication of work, and it increases the cost of ownership and complexity. Then another challenge is the lack of knowledge sharing. So when you have a successful implementation in one department, it is rarely shared with the other departments. And this leads again to duplication of efforts and resources. And then the big elephant in the room, which is security issues. So data security, authenticity, integrity, reliability, these are all issues that are happening. And normally when it comes to information security, realize that it's either left to the private partner who are operating the systems or just left with the government employees to manage. And then finally, there's also lack of standards where there are issues such on open standards and open source, leading to issues around sustainability and cost and others. So we need to understand that government is a complex, multi-layer organization. And then unless there are standards and well-defined guidelines, this complexity can lead to confusion and chaos. And this is what is happening not just in Sierra Leone, but then in most developing countries. So I'll take a pause and start thinking that what then can we do in order to make sure that we move from this chaos and then make sure that we are delivering services which are meeting the citizen needs. To overcome these issues, there's a need for a standard-based enterprise architecture framework. So enterprise architecture for the government, that is citizen-centric, first of all, open, standards-based, interoperable, transparent, flexible, secured, results-oriented, and dynamic. And that is something that government urgently needs. So that is concept number one, which is looking at enterprise architecture. So the World Bank has, in the last few years, published a number of digital economy diagnostic reports for countries such as Sierra Leone, Ghana, Senegal, and most recently, Liberia as well, which is currently work in progress. So let's pick the Sierra Leone one. I'm slightly biased here because then that is a country I'm working in. So I'm kind of, I know the issues which are happening. So in the Sierra Leone report, and a number of recommendations were given, but let's look at recommendation number 2. And this states that design and implement a whole of government ICT enterprise architecture to provide the foundation for digital transformation. So this recommendation for most diagnostic reports developed for West Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, this recommendation always comes up. The need for a whole of government ICT enterprise architecture. And it's very, very important. And the reason countries are struggling with most digital projects or digitalization of public services because of first silos, duplicative efforts by developed partners, and this is promoting fragmentation. So the silos is not just on the government side, but it's even on the donor side, the development partners. We are sometimes the cause of some of these issues. And then funding, which is difficult. Then scaling as well, because most of the platforms are not standard. And then also coordination. So in most government institutions, you find out that a ministry has been mandated to manage all ICT projects, but then working with other government agencies becomes very, very difficult. And so those are some of the struggles and issues that countries are having. So this leads us to the research problem or the problem statement that the governments of low middle income countries are struggling to deliver quality citizen-centric digital services. And this is due to the deployment of digital solutions that are narrowly scoped around specific user or single ministry or agency needs. So let's look at the 2 points right after the problem statement. So the first point is that this situation has compelled citizens to interact with multiple government ministries and agencies to get their requests. So what that means is that a citizen is required to produce the same information several times in order to access a particular service, which makes it very, very difficult and which makes delivering value for services very, very hard. So we'll skip the background session because I've already provided a bit of the background information. So to solve these challenges, there are a number of concepts or approaches which are being adapted by developed countries. And for example, we have Singapore, we have Estonia, we have India and others that are creating what we call the government stacks. And these government stacks are being done through concepts such as Govtech, DPIs, or Govstack. So Govtech is just a whole of government approach to public sector modernization. We have the DPIs, which refers to the digital solutions that enable the basic functions. Now, when you say basic functions, you are speaking to three main things: digital IDs, payments, and then also data exchange layers. So those three are seen as the foundations for digital public infrastructure. So a basic stack, then we can build on it. Then you also have the Govstack, which is a set of digital building blocks, and that allows organizations and governments to be able to harness the power of technology in delivering tailored services. So now we are bringing the concepts together, and this links directly to the research goal. So therefore, the goal of this research is to develop a novel model to iteratively evaluate the relevant building blocks to implementing integrated digital services leading to one government. And currently, this model is being tested in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and hopefully, I recently came from a mission in Ghana on the Ghana Digital Transformation Digital Acceleration Project. And we are hoping that as the project progresses, we can also test this model in Ghana. So then we'll have landed on three main countries. So let me give a bit on the research philosophy. So the research is guided by the interpretive perspective and then also a qualitative case study approach. The reason is that the plan is to examine in depth a complex process and learn from practice, hence the reflective practitioner method. So as previously mentioned, the government of Sierra Leone has decided to adopt a building block approach to implementation so that they can operate at scale and support multiple use cases and contexts to creating a digital public infrastructure. Now, the challenge is that the government in Sierra Leone, just like Liberia and others, is looking at the adoption model and how best to select these building blocks for digital services. So to do this, the research is guided by the design science research methodology adopted from PEFRES, and it works in three stages. So we have stage one, which is the definition of the problem, and this is done through literature review, understanding the objectives, and that becomes the entry point for the process. Then developing the first version of the artifact. So this is a tool, and this is done through quantitative data analysis or qualitative data analysis. So that is stage two. And then we have stage three, where then the tool is actually tested. So it's more of a proof of concept, then the evaluation by a panel of experts, and then finally, it is either communicated through journals or publications through professional publications and others. So, and this is those. So those are the three main stages that the research has taken or is going through. So the first one, remember in the early slides, I'd mentioned that a tool was developed from a previous research. So that is what we call the extended e-government or e-government extended process virtualization tool. Now, how this tool works, and this is where it gets very interesting. How this tool works is that it works with a number of constructs. So first of all, before we can even talk about building blocks, we need to understand that countries are struggling with the services or the processes to select in order to digitalize. Then now, after they've selected the processes or the services to digitalize, then now these services will then need to be mapped to the relevant building blocks. So the beginning stage of this approach in making sure that we are creating digital services which are interoperable is to use this tool to select the processes of the services to be digitalized. And this tool was actually built on research done by Bart and Martin on extended process virtualization theory, but the original work was actually done by Overby on process virtualization theory. But the difference here and the modification here is that apart from looking at the constructs for technology dimension, which is asking a series of questions and allocating weights to it, so based on the weights assigned, then we can define through a traffic light system. Can it be virtualized? Maybe it needs to virtualize, but you need to consider other factors, or it cannot be virtualized. Now, there's also elements of change management and others. So then a second dimension was developed, and what we are calling the authorizing dimension. So here we are looking at elements such as the authority, the capability, the change readiness, and others. And these on the constructs for this dimension was also pulled from another concept called PDIA, problem-driven iterative adaptation. So a combination of ePVT plus PDIA is what led to the e-government extended process virtualization theory. Now that we have a service, the next thing then is to link it directly to the Govstack. So from the Govstack community, we know that data governance services are composed of interoperable building blocks. And currently, Govstack has identified about 19 building blocks that make up any e-government service or platform. So then some of these building blocks are payments, messaging, consent management, identification, authentication, and information mediator. So if you're able to identify the right services or processes to virtualize, then what it means is that using the Govstack approach of where the building blocks, the specs for these building blocks have already been defined, there can be a direct mapping. So now the proposed equation is this, that for us to have an integrated digital service, it has to be three elements coming together: the EEPVT, the enterprise architecture, and then also the interoperable building blocks. So let me pause for 1 second here for us to really look at this slide, because this is extremely important. And based on the work that is currently ongoing in Liberia, what I've seen in Sierra Leone, this is the journey that most countries are taking. First, forming a government council, a CIO, on how best to select services to virtualize, making sure it's all inclusive. Then developing an enterprise architecture framework based on TOGAF, currently TOGAF 9.2, where you have the architecture development method, you have the whole cycle. And then now looking at elements of Govstack, where the building blocks and the specifications have already been defined, and bringing them together. So this is a formula that we are currently pushing to most developing countries to consider and to adopt in order to make sure that they have an integrated digital service or platforms. So the future of digital services, this is what we want to achieve. But then currently, this is the state that we have. In Africa, a lot of these countries are trying to move from what you are seeing in the current state to the future state. The limitations. This study has a number of limitations. First of all, it's been conducted on the perspective of government IT experts. So what it means is that future studies must incorporate findings from the citizens as well in developing countries, from policymakers, and then also from government officials. And then also the construct for the EEPVT and then the tool itself is drawn from literature, and it also has it is backed by empirical data collected through survey and focus group discussions. Now, because of the validation of the tool is limited to IT practitioners of Liberia and Sierra Leone, it cannot be universally applied yet. Okay, so it needs to be tested further to make sure that this is something that can be used by all countries. But for now, this is the progress that we've made with 2 main countries and planning to move into Ghana as well using the similar concept. So getting close to the final slide, I'll say this. and this is actually from biology, that it is important that countries avoid what we call isomorphic mimicry. I've seen a lot of this in the last 10 years doing development work, and it is worrying. So isomorphic mimicry is a term in biology which refers to different organisms evolving to look similar without actually being related. So this is what happens to some countries where governments is trying to mimic other government successes, like the Estonians, like the Singapores and others, and replicating their processes, systems, and even products and seeing it as best practice, but without necessarily defining context. So we do not want a government or a government data infrastructure that projects a form but does not have a function. So on this note, I'll bring this presentation to an end. I want to say thank you very much. I've been able to do this under record time, and we'll now open it up for questions. So I'll pass it on to Professor Jera to moderate the questions and answer sessions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Ransford, very big thanks. I mean,